Today, we're talking about financing smart infrastructure with a focus on the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Plan. I'm going to give you a few words of introduction here. Most of you hopefully know this, looking at the attendees, but the NYU Urban Lab is one of the research centers at the Schack Institute of Real Estate at NYU. We have a couple of different projects going on right now. This initiative, the Green New Deal for the FDR, has a lot of information on our website about the history of the FDR. And the overall initiative is to ask, as we look at large-scale investments in the city, in infrastructure, can we also make sure that we're looking through the lens of sustainability, equity, affordability, and ask ourselves how we could look at these projects cohesively. So we've done a series of panels in partnership with the Urban Land Institute, and then on our own, bringing together highlights of different pieces of the project. We started with the Harlem River Greenway. We did the East Side Coastal Resiliency, and this is the last in the fall series on Lower Manhattan. In addition to that, we're working with the American Institute of Architects, the IDC Foundation on New York City's affordable housing crisis. There's a draft paper that's been released. We're hopefully publishing that before the end of the year. We have been doing research on inclusive growth and ESG-based real estate development. How do you measure it? How do you score it? How do you know that it's actually happening? We have a deep dive on historic Black colleges and universities and understanding the parallel to how they were treated in community wealth creation, to how individual families were treated in family wealth creation due to redlining. And we have a study just kicking off on the adaptive reuse of malls and supercenters to make the suburbs start having some of the same amenities, density, and social categories as we've built in some of the urban centers. And finally, we're asking about what affordability means. Can we really look at housing in isolation when we talk about gentrification and affordability? Or is it part of a larger basket of goods that includes daycare and transportation and food? We've picked Reno, this fast gentrifying area, as a case study, and we'll be rolling that out as something that we can use in other cities as well. But that brings us to today. Today, this panel, I'm so pleased to be here with these very incredible panelists. Each one is going to get a chance to introduce themselves, but as a kickoff, I'm very happy here to have Kay Hayashi from BJH Advisors. We've had the pleasure of working together before when I was at the EDC. She's done a lot of large-scale value capture projects. She'll talk about some of those. Michael Santora, one of my colleagues from the Urban Land Institute, who's both a architect focusing on infrastructure and also the CEO of a robotics logistics firm in Boston. And then Donald Burns, my colleague and co-professor here at NYU, who wears his other hat as Director of Planning and Development for USDOT's Federal Transportation Administration. And finally, Alice Blank, my new friend, the Vice Chair of Manhattan Community Board 1. So I'm going to just give a little bit of background on the LMCR, and then I'm going to turn it over to each panelist to introduce themselves further, and then we'll get into a few questions. If you have questions for us in the audience, please use the Q&A feature, and myself or Daniela or one of the panelists will either respond real time or we'll push those to the end and answer those ones we didn't get to. Just as a background, our focus on a Green New Deal for the FDR is because the FDR spans this 10-mile east coast of Manhattan, stretching all the way down from Lower Manhattan and all the way up through Harlem. It's really a large-scale view of the waterfront that nobody has been able to plan as a single project, even since the time of Robert Moses. Our contention at the Urban Lab is that we'd like to draw attention to the fact that we can look at it at a larger scale as the city and state did on the west side with Hudson River Park, and be able to make overarching planning decisions, whatever those might be. It's an aging roadway that in sections is being renovated. Big dollars are being put into it at the same time as, due to rising seas and climate change and storm surge events, there is a look at making the whole coast more resilient, as well as other coasts around all of the 5 boroughs. And there are a lot of different resilience planning efforts that are underway, but many of them are segmented and they are separated from affordable housing planning, from smart highway planning, also from environmental justice issues, and from the fact that actually we have some new large-scale tools now at the federal, state, and city level that might be applied to make these projects achieve more social goals. Just showing briefly the significant flood and resilience issues that we could find all around Manhattan. Of course, looking toward the middle of the screen, you see pretty much the entire east coast of Manhattan is impacted. And there are indeed many efforts going on. I'm showing here just the ones kind of in lower Manhattan for this panel. They do extend all the way up in portions of the west and east side. Obviously, there are other initiatives in other boroughs, but we are focused on the FDR here. And again, today, we'll be looking at some of these current situations in lower Manhattan. We won't do a super deep dive into LMCR, but this is kind of the context and window that we're looking through, because every location is really different, and we can't, even if we want to do large scale planning, we have to do localized understanding of needs. So that brings us to LMCR. In general, it's an integrated coastal protection initiative that is mostly focusing on flood risk. There was a Lower Manhattan climate resilience study and a series of strategies that were decided upon to build resilience. And at the end of last year, there was a financial district and seaport climate resilience master plan created. The city is continuing to advance almost $1 billion toward 5 capital projects to reinforce these Lower Manhattan coastal areas. We can look at these 4 as the basic of those. That's the Brooklyn Bridge, Montgomery Coastal, Seaport, Battery, and Battery Park City. In each case, just as a reiteration, from the resiliency standpoint, we're talking about responding, first of all, to another storm event, similar as what we saw with Superstorm Sandy and how that really wreaked havoc on the entire 5 boroughs. But then separately than that, we also have to deal with sea level rise, what is going to happen over the short, mid, and long term. And finally, the constant pressure of wave run-up, as that can be slightly different than either of the first 2 conditions. Across that, we have projects that both are responding to immediate urgency, as well as some that are looking more toward planning for the long term. So we have some interim flood protection, but then also long-term coastal resilience areas. We have some barrier gates and tunnels around, around the Hugh Carey Tunnel, and then also long-term esplanades and seawalls that are all a part of this. And overall, that is, again, looking at each of these areas, what dollars can be allocated. Those projects that I mentioned before are all detailed here in terms of the estimated dollar amounts, the location, what the actual intervention is. And again, this won't be a panel describing all of that stuff. It's more giving you the context so that our folks here can talk about their roles and impact in that. So finally, I just want to say our next step as the Urban Lab is to integrate all the things we've heard in these 3 panels and in our Urban Land Institute panel last year into a paper and a set of tools that we'll release in the mid-spring. And then we plan to do a late spring national advisory panel with the Urban Land Institute, some of our panelists, some of the local community members, and see if we can't take a larger view at what integrated development or integrated funding or integrated planning might look like, and whether or not it could add anything to what is happening here with this project. So hopefully that is the most I will talk in the entire panel. Thank you for that patience. And now I would like to go through and allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves and talk about their relationship to either this project or projects like it. We'll just take a few minutes each. And I'd love to start with you, Professor Burns. Donald.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me, Matt. Definitely appreciate that. My background, I'm a planner by trade. I started with the Office of the Bronx Borough President in the local level, worked in the private sector, doing a number of local municipal planning for solid waste management and water and sewer. And so that it's what brought me into actually first looking at this type of work. And I currently work as the Director of Planning and Program Development for the United States Department of Transportation and Federal Transit Administration Region 2 office, and all the funding from New York and New Jersey comes through my office, and we work with the metropolitan planning organizations for planning transportation products along with Federal Highways Administration. With that, a lot of the response to Hurricane Sandy, that planning and that funding was partially coordinated through our office in Region 2, along with other federal agencies. And so we participated, if I didn't, some member of my staff or other folks in my office participated in a number of the transportation initiatives for resiliency. And so we've worked and we continue to work with the transit operators and the city of New York and Port Authority, New Jersey, on resiliency responses specifically to New York City area, New Jersey, and Lower Manhattan. With that, I think it's important to always to understand, and I'm glad you. I think that one slide you have with looking at the three different types of from storm surge to sea level rise to so that wave thing, because when you're dealing with this issue, you're dealing with those different issues, and so the storm surges may come with a major storm, but then sea level rise is something that's happening over time and something you see over time, and as a consequence of that, you will get with a much smaller storm that sort of wave erosion that comes with constant erosion over time because of sea level rise, and you see that difference. So and then the last thing I just want to throw out before is just as much as we try to plan for these, it's very difficult because the weather is a very difficult thing to deal with. And I'm going to use the example of the nuclear power plant in Japan had a seawall of 25 feet, and most Pacific tsunamis are 15 to 20 feet. So you'd figure a seawall of 25 feet is adequate to protect it. But that event was a 40-foot wave, and there's almost no way you can ever predict a 40-foot wave is going to happen. That's like a hand of God thing. That's biblical. And so as much as we try to plan for all of these. I think that the key is resiliency. We need to live with the water and work with it and be resilient. And with that, I'm going to pass it to the next panelist.
Thank you, Donald. Michael, I think you're up next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Santora. I'm the principal of SB+C Architecture. We're an international architecture practice focused on infrastructure. One of our projects that I think will come up later in here is some tunnel systems in Kuala Lumpur that were used dually for flood mitigation and transportation. I'm a resident of Lower Manhattan, so I know this area well, and certainly something needs to be done with it, not only for flood mitigation and for coastal resiliency, but also for just reconnecting the waterfront and making that as accessible to everyone as possible, and also thinking about some of the other infrastructure challenges that New York has that isn't just flood protection. Of course, there's got to be foresight for major things like that, but we've got day-to-day water problems that need solving, and we should talk about how those get integrated into this program. I'm also a robotics engineer, so we have a logistics automation company based out of Boston that focuses on new control systems for automated robots within warehouses and automated drayage vehicles that move things around ports and areas. And we are at the stage where we're looking to see how some of our technology can be integrated into the fabric of existing city infrastructures to improve the way goods move throughout. And I also think that is something relevant to how New York deals with its roadways, so that it accommodates more than just the cars, but all the extra trucks for all the online shopping we're all doing these days.
It's a great introduction. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Donald. I'm really excited for this conversation and also the thoughts of the movement of goods, both on roadways and also on water, personal passion of mine. But let's now turn to Kay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kay Hayashi. I spent a lot of my career in government, in the federal government, for Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey when he was alive. Spent 13 years at the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and then left public sector to start my own planning, real estate advisory, and kind of underwriting consulting shop. We're about 12 people. We're an MWBE firm. We do a lot of work for the government. And we were the financial funding consultant for the financial district and Seaport Climate Resilience Master Plan that Matt mentioned. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the funding and financing strategies we looked at for big infrastructure, including resiliency. It didn't specifically look at the FDR, but you know that the transportation aspect of infrastructure just sort of adds on to additional potential sources. And I'm really excited to be here and hear your questions.
Thank you, Kay. And last but not least, Alice.
Thanks very much, all, and Michael for inviting me. I'm Alice Blank. I'm an architect. I have a small practice down in Lower Manhattan and where I live. I also teach and write a little bit about architecture, planning, and landscape architecture. I'm vice chair of Manhattan Community Board 1 and chair of the board's Environmental Protection Committee. There are, as I'm sure you know, 59 community boards in the boroughs, and we are appointed in an advisory capacity by the borough president and our city council member to act as independent representatives or voices for the community. So I think that's why I'm here today. Community Board 1 encompasses most of Lower Manhattan from the south side of Canal Street, river to river, including the neighborhoods of Battery Park City, the Financial District, the South Street Seaport, Tribeca, and parts of the Civic Center, as well as Liberty Island, Ellis Island, and Governor's Island. So needless to say, resiliency is the name of our game. And as chair of the board's Environmental Protection Committee for the over past, I think, 6 or 7 years, I've been very involved with the review of all the resiliency plans of Manhattan, which include the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Plans, of course, the Battery Park City Authority plans, and the Battery Park plans. I also serve on the board of the Governor's Island Trust, representing our community. And as you may know, the island was rezoned 2 years ago, I think, allowing for new development, including for the addition of a new climate center you might be all aware of, which is very much now in our focus as well. So in these roles, I've had the opportunity to see how the process of community engagement works, and frankly, does not. So I'm delighted to be here today again, and many thanks.
Thank you so much, Alice. Really grateful to have all of you panelists here. What an exciting discussion. Overarching, well, the title is the Green New Deal for the FDR, and we're focused on LMCR as a window through this idea. We're going to try to bring things together for these big new ideas of integrating planning and also highlight some of the things that are going well and might also benefit from some improvements in what actually is happening right now. So I'd love to start with you, Kay. You had mentioned that you were a consultant to EDC in the city on portions of this plan. And I understand also it didn't consider reimagining a highway or the FDR, but you started to talk about funding and funding resiliency, what the structure of funds were and how that could change or be utilized. I'm curious to get some of your thoughts expanded on what you just mentioned in your introduction.
Absolutely. So the way we broke it down was we were looking at existing funding sources, kind of federal, state, city, and then potential new funding sources, and kind of analyzing the magnitude of those potential and existing sources against the cost of, you know, something huge related to resiliency. And we also looked at the resiliency options in terms of, you know, actually just that, we looked at different options. And so there was kind of a lot going on in the analysis. For something, you know, very large, infrastructure related, and something that serves not only the residents of the city, but the region. You know, the city and the state always want to look at federal sources. And so we looked at U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which actually was potentially our largest source, up to $3 billion for the resiliency plan. We looked at FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency funding for capital. Again, that was typically up to $50 million per grant. We looked at capital investment grants from the Federal Transit Administration. And again, if there's a transit component to the infrastructure, that pot could potentially be larger. We also looked at infrastructure for Rebuilding America and Rebuilding American Infrastructure Sustainability and Equity grants. These were programs that came into focus in 2021. And we also looked at the New York State Environmental Bond Act, which was a mechanism to access the capital markets for infrastructure. In terms of new funding, we looked at insurance surcharges. So when you are protecting areas, the assumption is that your annual insurance costs would be reduced. And so we were looking to tap into the savings and sort of harnessing those and monetizing them to fund capital for resiliency. We also looked at imposing a resilience surcharge or assessment on the protected assets. And these were primarily commercial buildings and some residential buildings in Lower Manhattan that would benefit from the resiliency measures. And we also looked at revenue from new development, or what's typically referred to as value capture, where you're creating spaces or opportunities for new, primarily commercial development, and then creating mechanisms and structures to capture the property taxes and other revenues generated from commercial activity, and monetize those to fund whatever is being developed. And it's sort of like a tax increment financing. And so we looked at all of those options and measured them, kind of high level order of magnitude against the options for the resilience.
Thank you. Really interesting. Speaking of that financing side, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more, on one hand, we have the actual resiliency work to be done. Another hand, we have the financing piece to see what things actually are meeting public goals done. But then at the bit, we talk about the influence on a local area and not just the citywide area. We have to ask what role the community has in having a voice in some of these selections and choices. So Alice, I wanted to ask you, in your role as vice chair of CB1, what do you think is going well, and what are areas for improvement with community involved with LMCR?
Well, thanks. Yeah, good question. And, I enjoy hearing a little bit from Kay about, how we finance these, because that's clearly one of our concerns. And we bring it up every time to all city agencies is, how are we paying for it? Like most recently with the United States Army Corps plans at $52 billion. And the question is, how? So I'm delighted to hear about some of these initiatives and hope that we go forward with those. Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of helpful aspect of this is to understand the challenges that any community, even one as advantaged as ours, has in front of it. It's a tall order to ask for a community to review the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency plans in terms of the enormity of the scope of work, its potential impacts on our coastal landscapes, and the technical expertise that's really needed to understand the climate science that pushes the plans, in addition to the financing, which I'm not, again, something we don't touch on enough. The other challenge that we see here, that we all see, is the multi-jurisdictional oversight of the plans. It's, an extraordinary challenge. Our community board is basically provided with quarterly updates, which cover multiple jurisdictions at the city, state, and federal levels. So these include the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, that looks to FIDI Seaport, along with the the Economic Development Corporation. Then you have the Department of Parks and Recreation, who oversees the battery plans. Then you have the Battery Park City Authority plans, that looks at the entire west side, the 92 acres at the south. And you have Hudson River Park Trust, who basically, I know you mentioned this earlier, Marco, have no resiliency plans, as you're probably aware. They assume that the park will flood at this point. And then now we have the addition of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, who's conducting their harbor and tributary studies. So that's a big challenge. And one of our asks, and has been for many years, is how do you bring these groups together? How do you have these groups work together in a consistent, coherent way that explains why one neighborhood's approach to resiliency is very different than another. Why, for example, or do we raise the coastline at Battery Park City at Wagner Fork 18 feet, but not so at the Battery, which is one of the most areas of most acute need, where we're just raising the wharf. And most of this actually, interestingly, we learn has to do with budget. We have an authority with money, we have a city with little. And that is often, unfortunately, the answer as to why we don't see consistency in some of these approaches on the tip of Manhattan. So another problem or challenge that we see is the timing of the engagement. And this is true not just for resiliency planning, but for all planning, which is missing from the engagement is the input from the community at the beginning of the process. We're asked to be reactive to plans that are already fundamentally set in stone, rather than working on these plans at the outset. This is a critical problem. We see it on every plan, in every neighborhood, on every issue. And additionally, in the case of Lower Manhattan coastal resiliency, we've asked and don't always receive, we're getting closer in getting plans presented not by agency representatives who respectfully may not be experts on these plans, but rather than the people that are actually designing the plans, the designers, the architects, landscape architects, and engineers who created them. And this is a critical missing point, as well as having the client scientists on hand to answer our questions. So these are things that we look forward to. And you know, there are many other areas of this, but I would say the other one is to keep in mind, as has been pointed out here by Donald, that, you know, you need flexibility in planning. Things don't stay the same. You can have the 40-foot wall, you know, horror story storm, and you cannot solve every problem. And you also have to believe that not every plan sticks to the same criteria for all through time. We see it right now at Battery Park City Authority. We presented plans for over 6 years. Another plan comes forward. You may have read about it in the New York Times. Many people in the community wanted this plan, but you know, the authority, understandably, no, we're going with the first plan. Well, I think all city agencies have to be open to the idea that there are many alternatives to be reviewed, and they should be reviewed in depth. And this would better, you know, would be an important sort of part of looking at plans at a community-based level, to keep an open mind and be flexible to all alternatives throughout the process. Anyway, I could go on, but I will leave you with that, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Michael, I want to turn to you. You've been a part of this effort for a while. You were part of our mini TAP last year on the FDR, as Kay was also, I neglected to mention. What kind of planning could we do with your architecture hat on? What kind of planning could we do? How would we do things differently if we wanted to integrate not just resiliency planning, but also be able to move forward with other needs, affordable housing on the waterfront, environmental justice, some of the work that you work on with your other hat around automation and logistics, drayage, even things like creating new land. How should we approach this in a different way if some of those are our goals, or do you think we're on track to integrating all those types of things in the way that we're planning?
Well, I don't think we're on track for that yet, but there's certainly potential for it. I think that all of this starts with correcting some longstanding issues with the FDR. And, I know you mentioned Moses before, and I'm sure a lot of the students here have read Power Broker and heard the story of the FDR, but they basically shoved it in whatever little space they had, which is why it's such a nightmare to drive on. But I think we need to, I think a lot of people since that time have come to the conclusion that urban highways are terrible, cars are terrible, all of this stuff. Like, if we have such a negative outlook on these things, it's going to be really hard for us to put more investment into it, since everyone thinks that they don't really belong. But I disagree. I actually think they do belong. I think that in terms of how we deal with transportation in the future of public transportation is going to be a vehicle, not necessarily a personal car, but a clean vehicle that is commoditized, like, a growth of Uber, where we're calling them, we're not necessarily owning them themselves, because we have spent so much time investing in roadways, and roadways are really the only method of ground transportation that gets us everywhere. right? You can't take a train to your front door. You can't take a boat to your front door, but you could certainly take a car there. So that's where we're going. And when we get that to be clean, when we get that to be driverless, it's going to be more accepted. So we need to take care of the infrastructure that gets that stuff around. And, you know, like the loop in Chicago, I think is a great example of how we've taken some of the vehicles that are not nice to be around as pedestrians and put them somewhere else. And that's exactly what the FDR does for us. So I know there's advocates of like, let's take this down and recapture the land. If we did that and shoved all those cars and potentially more cars onto the road, it makes it really, really uncomfortable for all the pedestrians. What we need to be doing more of is finding a way to concentrate vehicles to roads that are just for them and take them off of roads like some of the smaller streets in Lower Manhattan and things like that, and make those more pedestrian friendly. And in doing so, you know, finishing connections to other highways with the FDR, like as a resident of Lower Manhattan, I'm sure you guys have all been, you know, up around Houston Street waiting for all of the traffic that is going on to the Brooklyn Bridge to try and get past to go to the last exit on the FDR. And if you look at that, if we had completed the ramps between the Brooklyn Bridge and the B2E, not only would it take a tremendous traffic burden off of the Dumbo area, but it would probably smooth the traffic of the southbound cars coming on the FDR only to go to the Brooklyn Bridge. And that would make that road a lot better. And when we solve those problems initially, then we can start looking at what else we can do with the FDR. Like I love the programs on the Upper East Side where they're encouraging, and I believe it's only limited to universities and hospitals, to build over the highway. So we've all agreed that we've got to go up. New York has no problem with going vertical. So I see no reason why we wouldn't go up on the FDR, not to raise the highway, but to raise development above it. So we want our land to be high above the water. You know, some people go swimming in the East River. I don't, but we don't need to meet the coast at water level like there's a beach, right? If we were 20, 30 feet above the East River on a promenade, let's say the area from like the Manhattan Bridge to the Williamsburg Bridge, I know we've got a land extension on the other side of that, but just as a hypothetical, I would love to see something built above that. That's land that the city owns and it doesn't have to acquire necessarily. And that could be great waterfront property that connects to a promenade. That could be a mix of all types of uses, including affordable housing and some light industrial to take care of the package delivery and things like that. But let's bury that highway. I mean, why wouldn't we want the FDR to be in a place where it never saw rain or it never saw snow? So there's maintenance issues and accidents and things like that that come from that if they were covered. I mean, I would love to see the FDR covered all the way down with development that took full use of the waterfront and prioritized the pedestrian access to it. And the highway was just underneath, still functioning because we needed to function, but not anything that anyone needed to experience on our waterfront.
Wow, so many good ideas. I feel that leading to more discussion. I will challenge one item, given the context of this is resiliency. You said we can't take a boat to our door, but I'm not so sure. Depending on how the sea level rise goes, that might become a great mode of transportation. I don't know if anyone's read there's a science fiction book called New York 2140 that anticipates that. But given all of that information that was just thrown down, and specifically a lot about the future of transportation, Donald, I'd love to turn to you and ask what you think the future of transportation looks like in New York City. We have congestion as a primary concern. You heard some of the ideas that Michael was putting out there. What do you think about that future, including still the vehicles the way they are today, or different kinds of approaches to moving freight and passenger around New York City?
The future of transportation in the city is probably a lot of the future of transportation in the country. A lot of it goes to mobility, and I think Michael hit on some of it. I think there will be some sharing of vehicles. I think that will come back, but as you see today, when you get to the sort of what we call first mile, last mile trips, which is, your first trip out the door to maybe public transportation, or the first trip out your door to your car is always a pedestrian trip. I don't think that's going to change. I think the first mile, last mile trip will always be, and I think what we're seeing for a lot of those public transportation trips, people are looking to bike. I see more people on electric scooters. So I think that goes to mobility. Mobility is, so the future will be mobility, and then what that takes if we have a mix of bicycle and scooter. And if that's the case, it's how do we look at the future of the local street versus the main arterials versus the limited access highways? And getting to sort of what Michael's saying, we're still going to need goods as long as we have this urbanized area, and people do shopping, or everything comes in and out, as you know, Michael, and Matt, everything comes in and out some sort of way. It's either trucked in or come in through barge, or it's trucked out and goes out through barge. And so New York is a net importer. We don't have a lot of goods that we export. Our export is solid waste. And so we have to any of our future systems, and I'm lining this up because anything that we do, and Alice knows this because in her area has a major facility, a solid waste facility, that's not going to change. We may want to do, we may, no matter how many materials things change, always going to be a net exporter of solid waste in New York City. So we have to deal with that. We're going to need some ways vehicles to collect that, get it out. So we're going to need truck routes. We're going to need within that mobility to get around. That's part of the mobility. So it's the mobility of goods and services and the mobility of people, part of the future of the city. And how do we do that? And if we do have more technology, more autonomous vehicles, more of that, if the next step is what question do you want to answer? Is your concern congestion? Then a single occupancy autonomous vehicle is no different than a single autonomous internal combustion engine vehicle. It's still taking up the same space. And so conceptualized and transportation wise, that's the next thing. Do we want to have that many? Do we want to address them? How are we going to address some of these trips? And so I think the future transportation will be a way to deal with it where we can have fewer single occupancy trips, more shared trips, even if they are autonomous, even if we do have different hierarchy of vehicles. We will still have public transportation, we'll still have buses, and we'll still have autonomous vehicles, but I think it's going to be an interrelated network where you might switch from different types of vehicles and mobility to make your trips depending upon what your needs are.
It's a great set of issues and a good segue. If I could go back to you, Michael, given your robotics background, autonomy background, what's a smart highway, and does that have a role in New York City and specifically in the FDR with some of these issues we're talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be very hard, I think, for the FDR to become a smart highway. There are limitations to autonomy, and autonomy does really well right now in controlled environments and simpler situations. Like what we're seeing on the trucking side, there are some people out there that are focused on end-to-end autonomy. The majority of the industry is saying, let's get a truck to drive driverless the bulk of the distance, but when it's going on the city roads from the highway to the facility, that should be handled by a driver because there's just too much going on. We have pedestrians, we have bicyclists, we have other, street furniture and other things happening there that we don't have to deal with on the highways. So I don't know that the FDR would ever be a suitable smart highway for deliveries and things like that, but certainly it could be for autonomous vehicles. And I think part of doing that is creating new connections in and out of the highway that make up for what we would lose or the challenges we would create from the autonomous vehicles, right? Like if we created autonomous vehicle roadways, we would then want to concentrate those cars to the roadways, which is going to bring a lot more congestion. Now, I will argue that the congestion will be better if it's computer controlled rather than human controlled, because sometimes we make traffic for ourselves, right? You can't see over the hill of the highway, so you step on the brakes, but there's really no reason to slow down. But that slowdown actually ripples back miles and miles into traffic and causes, you ever get to the end of traffic and there's nothing there, and you're like, what happened? That's exactly what happens. So autonomous vehicles won't do that because they'll have other systems to see what's going on in front of it or have direct communication to the other vehicles so they can continue to go through that. But I do think that improving access to the road, creating more access points will help that out. If we're really going to make it a place to concentrate the autonomous vehicles as, getting from uptown to downtown, not, block to block. That's kind of what we have to do there. Like if you're coming north on the FDR getting off at 63rd Street, you're always going to be in a traffic jam because there's no exits on the northbound side till 96th Street. So everyone in between either has to get off there or go up north and come back down. If those improvements were made, I feel like some of the key congestion points throughout the FDR would go away and make it better for that. And then, there's obviously physical maintenance issues. Like, I heard one person say that they leave the FDR the way it is so people don't speed on it, which is kind of true because I think if I drove more than 40 miles an hour on the FDR, like my wheels would fall off and some of the potholes that I hit, right? So maybe that is the strategy. Doesn't sound like the right way to do things, but having a perfect surface, having clearer lane lines and things like that these autonomous vehicles use to read, because we don't want to get into a situation where we're adding additional infrastructure to the road. There was talks about putting magnetic guideways and things like that. I mean, if someone had to channel a magnetic wire in every bit of asphalt on every highway so cars could travel on them, it's never going to happen, right? We can't put the burden on the municipalities to create the infrastructure for driverless cars. We have to make driverless cars hold the technology, but we want the municipalities to hold up a certain standard of the road that's not so different than what they have now to make it as conducive as possible for the tech that we're creating on the private side to navigate these roadways.
Very interesting. Thank you. Okay, we've heard a lot of big ideas already. Certainly, there's a lot of big ideas going on right now. But in addition, we've heard some thoughts of improving or adding entry and exit to the highways. The idea of building over, maybe even building affordable housing over some areas. In some of our other panels, we've heard about the creation of additional land and supplementing the marine highway, the ability to get some of these freight trips off of the roads and onto the waterways. But then, of course, you'd need port facilities. What's the reality of these large ideas? And is there an ability to use something like value capture, some of the federal money sources you talked about to support this, especially given this multi-jurisdictional issues we have? What kind of comparisons can we draw to places like Hudson Yards and Moynihan Station? What should we be thinking as we try to rope these things together in one way?
Oh, you asked me such an easy question, Matt.
I know, should solve all the problems.
Solve all the problems. Well, I mean, I guess to break it down, yes, some of these things are already happening. It's really exciting. We are seeing congestion pricing actually kind of being put on as a way to capture some value of the demand that we're seeing generated on certain transportation access points. And actually that may change demand a little bit. But what we focus on is really, once the idea is decided upon, which can be really complicated, which idea moves forward first, how do you pay for it? And in New York State in particular, it's really complicated because there isn't a lot of autonomy at the local level to actually manipulate's not the right word, but steer certain revenue streams towards infrastructure funding. We're in what's called not a home rule state. And so in New York City, the municipal budgeting always works within a construct of state regulations and requirements, and there's often a state approval. But one of the mechanisms that's can be more locally controlled is property taxes. And that's typically what is referred to when people say value capture. And that mechanism has been used in Hudson Yards and also not as well known, but in Moynihan Station for the for a partial payment of phase 2, which of the Amtrak train hall. I don't know if anyone's been in the new Moynihan Station, but it's actually, it's a really lovely piece of infrastructure that required a lot of complicated thinking through on the financing side. And so there was definitely federal grant money. There was a state funding that came through the state budgeting process. And then there was kind of a local component, if you will. The developer of the retail and the Facebook office space at Moynihan Station is required to pay a payment in lieu of taxes, which is kind of like a property tax. And the state, as the holder of the asset, collects those property taxes and has monetized them for a loan that is being used to pay for that Amtrak, for a portion of the phase 2 Amtrak. So, value capture is real. It really depends on there being new demand, and in particular for commercial uses, because in New York City, often our property taxes are waived for the creation of housing and affordable housing. And then this mechanism was also used in Hudson Yards. But unlike some of the reporting is really confusing on Hudson Yards, the value there was captured not for the creation of the high-end retail, but actually for the creation of the extension of the number 7 line, which is a transportation asset. The value capture was used for the payment of the parks, and not the Highline Park, but some of the more pocket parks that kind of line and pepper Hudson Yards. And then the third thing the value capture was used for was for the subsidy for affordable housing in Hudson Yards. There's actually a large component of affordable units in Hudson Yards. So it is really complicated, these questions of how to layer on different public sector needs and to efficiently fund them. But it's so great that you guys are thinking about it.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience that I want to throw in, which is how complicated, this is from Miguel, how complicated is it to meet all the requirements of the funding sources, given the complexity and magnitude of the project and all the stakeholders involved? How do they stack against community and city goals? That one's open, but I don't know if Kay, if you want to take a first stab at it in terms of the different requirements of different funding sources.
Yes, that's a very good point. They all have different requirements. FEMA's requirements will be different from US DOT, and that will also be different from something like, a city property tax requirements. So that's one of the reasons there are usually lots of consultants, attorneys, and budgeting, people on these projects, kind of looking at the big picture and also how to break it down to meet these requirements. And the community is absolutely involved in big decision making like this, either through the land use approvals. I guess I'll let someone else answer the community component, but it's critical to get community buy-in. Alice,
you're on the hook.
Well,
so
I'm not sure.
Let's relate this back to whether projects are getting chosen because of the big vision of the city, because of a community need, or because of the ability to finance it from a funding source. For example, these ideas of putting affordable housing and building over the FDR or creating new on and off ramps, how do you think the community would respond to those kinds of ideas?
Well, to answer the first question, I'd say, the community's desires for what they would like, or I would argue, is not the priority in any agency decision making, and I would say the financing certainly and understandably is. Our community, of course, who doesn't really, or maybe there are folks who do not believe in the significance of affordable housing. I don't know if you're all following what goes on at the World Trade Center, but 5 World Trade Center is a project that we're very wedded to, trying to get 100% affordability. So this community is extremely interested in a community that was once very mixed. It's just become a kind of one-note economic community. In terms of the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency plans, we fought against what was then called Bloomberg City, and the tremendous amount of development that was being shown years ago. when Mayor Bloomberg was putting that forth. And the community is pretty wed in not wanting to see a large scale development in this new extension and have fought hard against it. Now, it's an interesting thing because we thought when we were presented recently with plans, like a few months ago, and you see 2- and 3-story buildings coming along the new plan and no towers anymore, we thought, oh, the community, the city is really listening. But what we learned, of course, is that the city is listening, but it's listening to the regulatory bodies that are saying we can't build these huge towers in this particular area, which was an interesting coming together of two things that worked, I think, for us. You know, I think the community is very interested in the plans that are certainly not or not being put forth at this moment, but are part of the plan, which is to look at the FDR as an extension of the city that goes out into the water and allows for the sort of knitting back of the urban fabric to the waterfront. And the removal of that is something that I know our board looked at carefully for a brief period of time when it was being discussed, I guess a couple of years ago when those plans were shown. But you know, because our main interest and the community really wants to see large green areas for recreation. You know, the west side, the east side rather, has nothing like that, and we are often drilling in on that, down on that point. So, you know, it's a little bit, and we support that there's going to have to be some amount of commercial development to do this in this park. But, you know, so yes, we support the idea of removing the FDR in some way to allow for more green space. But in terms of allowing for unbridled development on this extension, I'd say the community would be wholeheartedly against that. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but that's a.
Oh, it's a great answer.
Yeah.
I think we're just looking to kick around the ideas. Anyone else want to hit that one before I go to the next one?
Sure, I'll give a little shot.
Go
I
for
think
it.
it's always important, you know, no matter if the community feels their comments haven't been met or but it's always important to reach out, to meet with the community, to discuss community, to discuss community goals, try and incorporate community goals into any of these, in any project or any projects. One, it enhances it. Two, a lot of times you learn things that you don't always necessarily know. Coming from my end, that you didn't know always know from community members, and so and that outreach. The problem that we always get is sometimes it takes time, and with everything needing to be done yesterday, sometimes that outreach does take time, but we do require it, we do want it, and we you know, from you know, putting my day job hat on, we do need it, and we do desire it, you know, to make products better. To find out really how we can address a lot of the local needs, and getting to this specific, you know, FDR, there are a lot of ways. There's no one way to do a resiliency project on the FDR. There are many ways to do it, and there may be many ways to do it. And, you know, I could say, you know, just improvements we could make to the west side. Let me talk about FDR first. Again, I said resiliency. I'd like to find a resilient way of doing it, to incorporate, to keep automobile traffic, because I agree with Michael that the automobile traffic on the FDR keeps a lot of the automobiles off the streets, where a lot of the pedestrians are, and I think you know, separating use sometimes adds to safety. The other thing that I'd like to see with any resiliency plan is also separating the mobility, a better separation of the bike lane from where the pedestrians are. Because if you're on the west side, I don't know how many people I know who've gotten into the bike pedestrian conflict accidents and things like that on the west side. So a better planned out would be what I would like to see for any future FDR. I would like to see multi-purpose lanes. I'd like to see mixed use development where we can do it, and that includes commercial and affordable housing, And I think that's really what makes New York City the robust area. And just to give a plug, I just saw the Robert Moses play Straight Line Crazy, and they have a Jane Jacobs line at the end. You know how much she fought to save Greenwich Village, and then now it became an area where the neighborhood she's trying to save the neighborhood, but then the neighborhood she saved changed. And it became an area that those people couldn't afford to live in. And I think what we're trying to do, no matter what we do, is to keep the city a place where all people can live in. We're all mixes. And I think that those are the basic goals: livability, mobility, a place where New York City can continue to thrive for the next 100 years, and with place. So I think those are goals, and I think as long as we keep these goals in all the plans, we'll get to where we want to be.
Michael, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, just on the community board issue, I do think it's challenging to get a clear read of what the community wants, because our communities are so large. And my experience in community boards is that there are people that take it really seriously and spend a lot of time there and participate. And we're always grateful for those people that want to participate, because you need those volunteers. But I don't know that those people's voices necessarily represent everybody's voices. These are just the people that speak out. Like when I was doing landmarks presentations in the West Village, it was the same three people that would, throw tomatoes at me as we were presenting and tell me that they hated it and nothing should ever change, and things would go on as they did. But do they speak for the entire West Village? Does everyone hate this building? Does everyone not want to see it improved? The answer is we don't know. And I think that there are probably a lot of opinions on how Lower Manhattan can be improved, from modifying the FDR or changing it in some way. I know I had a proposal originally with EDC to put it underground and use it dually as a flood protection device. So when we designed the tunnel system in Kuala Lumpur, it was actually for overflow. So it was the opposite. It was overflow, but in times when it wasn't flooding, because it's always flooding there, vehicles could use it as an express lane. Here would be, our proposal was a little bit different, put the highway underground, and if it ever flooded, we can stop cars from going in there and use it as a detention tank, kind of like how the Hugh L. Carey tunnel and some of the subway tunnels became detention tanks, except we didn't really want them to be. They just happened to be during Sandy. So I think that there are tons of creative ideas out there that deserve a broader look and want more participation. And this is an encouragement to everybody on here to get out and have your voice heard in the community board or whatever forums are out there. Because again, historically, from what I've seen, there's a select few people that are really passionate about it and participate a lot. But I don't know that that is a full representation of what everybody's needs are. And certainly with the way the city is growing with our affordable housing needs, I'm not saying that we need skyscrapers along the water that block the light in from the rest of it. But certainly if we're going to go for something there, we have to do it in New York style, and New York style is density.
If I can just defend the community perspective for 1 second, the 50 members that are appointed are presumably representatives for the community, and their resolutions and their engagement is kind of what we've got. So I think your call to have people really take advantage of the system as best we can is what we need to do. And as early as we can see the levels of alternative that you're describing, for example, then it's possible to have potential buy-in. But as I mentioned earlier, what happens is when it's already pretty much gelled and it's presented, the lack of interest and engagement is apparent. And so I would say early and often. Thanks.
You're absolutely right. I've been to several events that were categorized as, we want to hear what the community thinks about this problem. And it turns into, here's a solution we can afford for this problem, and this is what we're going to do. Any questions? And that's wrong, right? Like when you go in there thinking that this is an open mind discussion where your ideas are going to be heard, and the presentation is already gotten to a level where you really can't add in what you want or what you thought and it's laid out there for you, it's discouraging. And, you know, you don't get anywhere. And I understand the other side of it, the city or whatever agency is putting this forward is saying, well, if we spend all this time on community engagement, we'll never get anywhere. We kind of have to give them what we think they should want and convince them that they want it. And, you know, I think that I don't have the answer, but there certainly needs to be a better way that can expedite projects, because historically we do things really, really slow here, which is a problem. You know, we may not get this thing in place before the next flood comes, whatever the solution is.
Right. I mean, I think we saw some very good engagement, and there are some very good examples. And unfortunately, you saw it at East Side Coastal Resiliency, and then things changed. You know, I have seen examples where the city really has worked very closely with the community in what I would call working groups, with the experts, with the designers like yourself involved, really, you know, hands-on at a table looking at planning. I mean, for example, I will tell you that in the years that I have been looking at these plans, I have never, I think, or maybe once, seen the Department of City Planning representative in the meetings. We have no planners in the meetings. You know, this is a critically, you know, missing component. And it's very hard to engage and to look at planning when you're not really talking about planning. You're talking about development, you're talking about aspects of planning, but not really the urban plan. What does it really mean? And so, you know, I don't know, there's a million solutions that come to mind, but the one that's very simple is when the idea starts is to engage with the community at that moment. And then you don't hear what we often say, which is, you know, you're giving us something that's already been decided, and we're responding to it, and we don't like it, and that's the end of the story. It's a pointless and unhelpful endeavor. You know?
I think you're absolutely right, and even on the consultancy side too. You know, you mentioned you're running a smaller, medium-sized practice. I think that there are a lot of people in New York that have great minds on architecture, engineering, that also don't get a chance. Like, whenever I hear a project is getting redone, it's like, well, AECOM and Arup already did all this for the project, and now we're telling everyone that there's a project. Like, the initial thought happens with 5 firms that always get all the work, and then it is projected as the initial thought after they've already gotten it 20-30% of the way, and that's really frustrating for people too.
100%, Michael, 100% agree. Absolutely.
And I don't think, you know, seeing how those companies grow, you know, growing entities that are supposed to be thought focused by the practice of rapid M&A isn't really the way to motivate thought in a design practice like that. Like, those types of groups, you know, they kind of get homogenized into this big group and you know, blended in with other things and company politics and stuff like that. I do think that New York needs to do better on focusing on the talented New Yorkers that live and experience this day to day, and get their voices heard much earlier on in the process than some of these big go-tos that don't necessarily have the insight that the locals do have.
Oh yeah, I just want to say something on that. I also think that I think it's helpful to separate the planning entity from the engineering entity. I mean, I often have seen AECOM and others use the planning front to, you know, advance a big engineering project that then the engineering firms are also involved in. I mean, not to be so cynical, but I do think it helps to have different entities kind of, and have a separation of the planning and the engineering.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, Kate, because that's the best way of saying this. In my day job, that's our requirement. We separate the planning from the engineering. But then that's also a criticism we get, for sometimes it takes too long. And so, and sometimes we say, but that's what good planning is, you know, we have to look at it, talk to people, plan it out, you know, say, okay, is this the right thing to do? Okay, can we fund it? You know, sometimes that takes time. So it's a back and forth, because yeah, it does, and it does. It's funny, for those in the public-private course. Yeah, it's funny. I did the public-private development course last, and I did talk about design build and all that. And design build is a funny thing because it's a good process, but I think sometimes what we're finding now is some public agencies are even putting it into the planning process, and that cuts planning out of the process. And so what you're getting is design build with not a lot of planning. And again, everyone wants to get everything done quickly. And so you end up with sometimes of projects that the budget balloons because it wasn't well thought out. Yeah. And as they get in further into design, they realize, oh, we can't do this. We need to backtrack and do more design around this issue that if they had done a little more planning, they would have figured that out, that was an issue. And that's the issue with now with design build. I think that you still have to do a certain amount of planning before you go into the design build process. Because and I think we're all saying it, certain things you just can't get around. And they're going to take time to deal with it before you can move a project ahead. And I think that's the best way of saying it.
I'm going to take us in a little bit of a different direction with the next question from the audience. In terms of creating a singular governing body that would have the sole power of managing the FDR, thereby consolidating power, could anyone foresee a way to use legislation, be it local, state, or federal, to create a governing entity? Or must all parties come to agreement on each section in order to develop the FDR? This is a reference to a statement that we've made before at the Urban Lab, the idea of creating something like a Hudson River Park Trust that could help coordinate some of these engagement, planning, development issues. So what thoughts do we have on the panel about that idea and a mechanism for doing it, whether it be the trust mechanism, and I'm sure Alice will have something to say about that, or some other mechanism?
I can only say that this has been an idea that's floated around our community quite a bit for the East Side plans, so that there would be this, additional sort of layer, or perhaps, in place of, much like the Battery Park City Authority or the Hudson River Park Trust. And no one's really come up, and maybe this panel could, with how that might or might not be helpful and how it could actually be enacted. But it is something that we definitely have thought about and talked about.
And what was the driver for talking about it? The people that are bringing it up are desiring that because they view it as something that would help direct information flow or consolidate funding, or what is all
of the above? Exactly. I think there's a great concern that there is no kind of controlling mechanism for what's happening, that it's very disjointed and slightly incoherent as to, what exactly is going on and who is precisely in control, what agency really has the oversight for the whole of this area. So these are the reasons. And they also want more input, more community input. So there's this belief that in this kind of a entity, you might be able to achieve that. So, and it's coming from groups that are pretty strong, not-for-profits in that area, who are looking at the Seaport Coalition, for example, and people are very wed to this neighborhood and know it very well. So, that it comes up more than not. So it's an interesting one to really consider. And it's great that the Urban Lab is looking at that. I would be really interested to know what kinds of thoughts you all have.
Yeah, well, it's interesting process, and I'll kind of tee it up for Kay to go after me. I would say, as someone who worked for the EDC for 6 years and was in charge of the East Side projects on the waterfront, and that were managed by the EDC or Dock NYC or NYC Ferry, even the Seaport, I would say I even found it impenetrable to understand what was going on with the resiliency planning and who was in charge. And very often, even an asset that we thought we were in charge of, another agency would be moving forward with a different plan, and it wasn't clear what the clearinghouse was for that plan. And that's when I personally first started thinking about that. On my other hat, I have a very big belief that since the 70s, when we really have gutted a lot of the budget and support staff in the federal, state, and local governments, that an answer to that, really written about a lot by Lindsay Galen, is the public developer concept, that we can fork off entities like Battery Park City Authority, like Hudson River Park, like the Trust for Governor's Island, like Brooklyn Ridge Park, that actually with a singular focus and a singular point of contact can help both communicate constantly as their sole, focus about what is going on in that ways, navigate some of the different schedules of others that are often driven by funding or election deadlines and not by long-term planning, and then also leverage the whole to create cross-subsidy so that an area like Harlem doesn't get a worse treatment than a high-value area because you're able to pool some of those funds to have a consistent approach. Now, one can criticize everything I just said, like from the opposite perspective, how it works against communities in that way. But I do think, given the confusion of so many different people about how to get involved and who is in charge at a very basic level, it would seem to me that an entity like that could be useful. I don't know, Kay, what's your take on this?
My take is to go and vote. And, for every elected office that, you can, because it is really confusing. And I think even despite creation of things like the Trust for Governor's Island, it's the trust, for instance, is somewhat autonomous, but reports to a deputy mayor. And then also the city question whether or not it's like fully funded for its agenda. So, I think it gets really, really complicated. I think in New York City, where there's so much density and so many jurisdictions, governance is always going to be an issue. And I do think a single strong governing body that has the cooperation of its partner entities is always going to be more successful in rolling out funding, executing a plan, a big infrastructure plan. I know this came up in the Sunnyside Yards master plan. There was Amtrak, there was the MTA, there was the city, there was the state. And it isn't really clear, but kind of tackling the governance question as a part of the planning effort. Actually, it is a part of the thinking through the plan is really important. And in some ways it's confusing and how a community member or an individual could get involved when it's a huge project and most multi-jurisdictional. On the other hand, it could potentially be an opportunity. And I do think that even though there isn't home rule in New York State, the land use process is always the place for, to start to get involved. We have a really robust, at least in my opinion, I don't know, I guess others may disagree. I think we have a really active community involvement in our land use process. And so many of these things are going to require discretionary land use approvals.
Other thoughts on the governance, or we can move to the final question?
I just have a quick thing on governance, just to follow up on Kay's point is, in terms of land use, the city's ULURP process is always questioned. It takes too long. It doesn't have enough this, it doesn't have enough that, but it is a process that we all have and look at. And so that might be probably another panel for you. But looking at that too, and how to do that. But governance is definitely key when you're looking at something like the FDR and everything that we're discussing.
I find that the people who criticize ULURP the most are the ones that haven't worked in a jurisdiction with no uniform process. Because I've worked in many of those jurisdictions. In particular, I'm thinking about Augusta, Georgia, and Austin, Texas, where you have projects that have been pitched with developers on the hook for 15, 20, 25 years with no way to get a defined time frame for feedback. So while 18 to 24 months is long, it's shorter than no timeline, no structured way to get things through, which isn't to say that we can't improve that process. I know that VP Reynoso has been talking about getting rid of ULURP and creating a comprehensive planning process citywide, which again, having been a part of citywide comprehensive planning, I'm not sure that that's I'm not sure that those things are really in tension with one another. They're actually two different timelines accomplishing different purposes. I think the idea of comprehensive planning is a fantastic one, but I'm not sure quite how to relate it back to individual land use actions and the timeframes that those are needed under. Anyone else want to weigh in there? Okay, last question I have from Miguel. Green energy generation technologies seem to be absent from the coastal resiliency plan. It is a way to self-fund the project. Have any been considered, for example, wave power, highway energy generation, et cetera? Well, I'm going to take a first stab at this, just to give you all time to think about that question. It's interesting because there is a great deal of green energy going on in the New York area, and in particular, there seems to be an increased need for support around offshore wind, additional facilities that will allow for maintenance and operations to get out there to support that technology. The idea of each of these different types of renewable technologies have different ideal locations. And for wind, for instance, far out on the edge of the continental shelf is better for visibility, fishing, et cetera, longer distribution, but better for sort of community impacts. We at EDC actually started looking at tidal power in the East River to try to understand if it can offset the load, in particular from Hunts Point Food Distribution Center. I believe there's only one water power, I think it is tidal power in the East River. I believe it's on Roosevelt Island, connecting to the Cornell Technion campus, and it has been remarkably inefficient, which I believe is why nobody has tried to replicate that. For those that don't know, the East River is not actually a river, it's a tidal estuary. And so the tidal and wave power is extremely limited. And the change in tides is very small. So it's not actually that great location for wave or tidal power. Of course, the one-off events, there are technologies that allow for capturing a power from one-off wave events, one-off surge events. And also there's the opportunity that is probably more real for geothermal running under any side of coastal action. The big issue with geothermal is always the Army Corps and getting permission to actually run through some of those cooling loops that can offset loads in that area. So I think I've wasted enough time that some of you that are smarter about these areas might have something to say. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on any of these issues about green energy generation.
I think it would be difficult to have green energy be a funder for the project as suggested. I think that as great as it is, we do have to realize that creating these green energy, as much as we have to do it, they're not something that we build for cheap that can then generate enough power to offset the cost of anything else. I think we're having enough challenges having them offset the cost of their own construction. And we also have to remember that when we do things like build wind farms way out where they capture the most wind, we're also increasing the losses on transmission. The AC transmission losses are pretty substantial. Even with good technology, we're dealing with an aging grid. I think that it's a good point, and that we do need to look into it more. The technologies that may provide the best benefit along the coast where the FDR is may not be developed to the point now that they're going to provide that benefit, but they certainly will get there by the time we get to the point that we're redeveloping the FDR. And I do think that that is important, because the more localized we get with clean energy generation, the better we're going to be. Concentrating a power plant, whether it's old school or something new and green far, far away, always has a huge loss factor. So finding ways to place this infrastructure strategically closer to where the consumption is going to help us out a lot. And that in itself is going to make it greener, because we're going to mitigate those construction loss. And even though I don't know, again, what that technology would be specifically on the FDR, because it's such a long-term project, we should be looking to emerging technologies and making sure that ample consideration for space for that is included with the cars and the bike lanes and all the other stuff that we're talking about that would go there.
I find this all really fascinating. Yes, I think this is a new NYU lab topic. You know, one thing I could say, we see very little of this in terms of any presentation. And you know, what exactly are the green energy initiatives, if any? And moreover, what we don't see is any understanding of the cost benefit analysis of how much, for example, embodied carbon is being used in a project. What does it mean to readapt an existing building or landscape versus bring it down and construct something else. That is never mentioned. And it is a critical missing component in every presentation. And frankly, in city legislation that we all should be thinking about is to, how do we do what other cities in the world do, which is to account for this. You know, not so long ago, I was amazed that Sadiq Khan, Mayor Sadiq Khan in London, holds up the taking down of a Marks and Spencer store on Oxford Street, because there was a tremendous community, question as to how much carbon was involved in this, takedown and reconstruction. Well, it's a question to be asked, and we never, ever hear about it. So I add that into the other bigger picture of tidal power, wind power, solar power, just what you've got versus what you're getting. And then an accounting of that is critical.
Well, I appreciate that. I think we're going to have to end there, but I will end on a preview that the Urban Lab in the spring will be taking a closer look at Local Law 97, the impacts, the disproportionate impacts at different income levels, the concept of what people think they're supposed to do versus what outcomes will just happen from waiting and watching the grid actually change underneath. And I think also this issue of already existing buildings versus takedown and rebuild, and actually accounting for construction and waste costs. As Donald has told us, we're primarily an exporter of waste. So that leads to all of those additional costs as well. But I want to thank you all panelists. Thank you everyone for attending. We will be doing a write-up of this, which we will share with all of you. We'll continue to do panels in the spring, but I wish you all a happy holiday, and appreciate everyone's contributions to this. We'll be certain to keep everybody in the loop.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.